Well, tonight he has brought one of the veterans from the lecture series, which he's talking about veterans on. Well, tonight he has brought one of the veterans from the lecture series, which he's talking about veterans on Cajun veterans on D-Day, the Untold Stories, and he's brought with him Lloyd Berard, B-E-R-A-R-D, Bayard, and his wife Mary. And I just found out from talking to Mary that she was Rosie the Riveter in World War II. I found out they made Catalina airplanes in New Orleans, and she was a riveter in that factory. Okay, so with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Jason Theriot. Jason?
Good evening. Bonsoir. Okay, thank y'all for having me back here. This is a wonderful evening. We've got some special guests here. And Mr. CJ, I, of course, want to thank you again. Yeah, lights off. We're fine. Off. Yeah, sure. That much better? Okay. I do have to say, and I think I've said this before, I've given a few lectures around the region and in Houston area over the last 5 or 6 years, and this is by far one of the best, if not the best, lecture series that I've ever been a part of, and I'm honored to be invited again here tonight. You guys put on a great show, Mr. CJ and Mr. Gary and the rest of the crew. Thank y'all. And of course the audience for coming out full, strong again tonight. It's always wonderful to see familiar faces, particularly those of the great generation. So thank y'all. Tonight we're going to be telling stories, untold stories, about D-Day. When I started this project 5 or 6 years ago, I interviewed my grandfather, Theriot. He's from Boudreaux Canal, from the Chauvin area. And I had no idea that this project I was getting involved with was going to take me on the route that it did. That was 5 or 6 years ago. Here I am. I've interviewed almost 200 veterans from the area and written 3 books. And my love for World War II and the thrill that I've had began at such a young age, reading about it and watching the movies like The Longest Day. I remember that. A great movie. What a great list of actors it had in that black and white film. And in 2000, I went on a family trip and I picked up Stephen Ambrose's book, The D-Day. I'd never read any of his work before, and I read front to cover, and for those of you who've read it, you know that is an excellent piece of work there. And that at that particular moment, I decided I wanted to write myself a book and interview Cajun veterans from South Louisiana and preserve their stories. Of course, the opening of the D-Day Museum, which was very exciting for me. And in 2004, I took a trip to Normandy beaches. I've got some photographs here tonight that you guys will be able to view. So for me, of all the battles, of all the great moments of the Second World War, D-Day is for me the most intriguing and most exciting. And I've got some stories about 3 Cajun veterans from South Louisiana who were there to experience it. Bob Adams was a Navy spotter pilot who flew aircraft cover over D-Day, over Omaha Beach on June 6th. Lloyd Berard, our special guest here, who's kind enough to bring his whole family from Coda Homes. We appreciate you guys traveling the distance. Thank you. Lloyd Berard was an engineer on the Mulberry Harbor. How many folks have heard of the Mulberry Harbor? Well, not too many. Great, great. It's a fascinating topic, and we'll get into great detail with that this evening. Houston Duhon and Carol Medier for the 397th Anti-Aircraft Special Battalion machine gunners. They also landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. Al Spoonheimer was in the 197th, a medic who landed right next to these guys. Spent the Normandy, the 60th anniversary of Normandy trip with this fellow from Vermont, and he's got a great perspective as a medic on what it was like saving lives. And unfortunately, pulling some of the dead bodies out of the beach that morning. We're going to get started off with Bob Adams. He's still living, lives in Lafayette. Bob Adams, originally from Houma, and I heard a fella here today say they pronounce Adams a little bit different down here. But in fact, he did grow up in the Houma area. His father was in the railroad business. He moved all over Acadiana, Lafayette, New Iberia, Weeks Island, and he still lives in Lafayette today in the Coast Guard Auxiliary, which is what he's been doing for the last 50 years. Couldn't make it today, not in the greatest of health, but we do appreciate giving him an invite. Bob Adams was the eyes of the fleet. He'd always wanted to fly. He was infatuated with the Flying Tigers, the P-40s in China. And he joined the Navy Air Corps just after Pearl Harbor. And just before he was able to join the Air Corps, he was attending SLI, the college in Lafayette. And SLI had a class on piloting. They had purchased a little Piper Cub, if you will, for $999. They kept it at Lafayette Regional in a little hangar. And Bob said that when it was time for them to go for their class and do a little solo flight, they grab the tail of this little aircraft, wheel it back on out, jump in and take off and do a little bit of flying. And in fact, it was on Pearl Harbor Day, he was actually doing a solo flight when he heard the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor in the Second World War from the United States began the following day. So as I said, he joined the Navy Air Corps, wanted to join the P-40s. He wanted to fly the big, fast, heavy, super-duper aircrafts that the Flying Tigers and Chenault had made famous. But unfortunately, he didn't get that opportunity right away. And he was assigned to Corpus Christi in the seaplane base. And he was flying the Curtiss SOC-2, which was a biplane reconnaissance seacraft that he trained in for 2 years. And then in 1944, the beginning of 1944, before the D-Day invasion, he was sent to Maine, and he was assigned to the USS Augusta, the flagship of the North Atlantic Fleet. In order to fly spotter aircraft from this heavy cruiser. And here's a photograph. They would take these little amphibs and shoot them off of catapults from the decks of these heavy cruisers. And they would cruise ahead of the fleet looking for C.J. Chris's U-boats, mines, other aircrafts, or any other enemy ships within the region. They were also armed. They were armed, but they were mainly for reconnaissance. And that's what he did for 3 months. There's a photograph of the great big ship, USS Augusta. The Augusta, the heavy cruiser, the flagship of the North Atlantic Fleet, had a lot of firsts in the U.S. Navy, particularly during World War II. And in fact, in 1937, there's a quiz, pop quiz for anyone in here. In 1937, the USS Augusta was parked off the coast of China for the Sino-Japanese War, the conflict that was brewing over there. And there was a sailor aboard this ship who was killed, you know who it is, who was killed when a Japanese artillery shell came over and landed on the deck of the ship, and the sailor was killed. He would become the first casualty, the first American casualty of what would eventually become the Second World War. Does anyone know who that fellow was? That's right, Betty Falgout from Raceland, Louisiana. That's correct. 1937. Also in August of 41, Churchill and Roosevelt met for the Atlantic Charter on this ship, one of the historic meetings for the USS Augusta just before Pearl Harbor. And so this group of fellows right here, as they came off of their cruisers and their battleships, these experts at spotter aircraft, when they came into England in February of 1944, these fellows were handpicked to do a very special mission. The squadron was created, and it was called VCS-7. There were 17 pilots that were chosen to fly spotter aircraft cover for the battleships and the cruisers and the destroyers on D-Day. And in September of 43, the year before, in the invasion of Italy, they had used high-flying highly maneuverable spotter aircraft for that particular invasion, and they proved excellent, fared much better than the old biplanes, the seaplanes that they had been using before in North Africa and in Sicily. So they had learned from the September 43 invasion of Italy, and they assigned these guys to highly maneuverable fast aircraft. And these particular American pilots got an opportunity to fly the British Spitfires. And in fact, they trained on these aircraft a month prior to D-Day. And their mission would be to fly over Omaha Beach and provide reconnaissance for the battleships and the big ships offshore. So this was a very special mission for a very special select group of individuals. And the Spitfire, just a few figures here, the Spitfire could do 200 miles an hour. It was a 12-cylinder Rolls-Royce engine, had 6 cannons, and of course in 1940, the Battle of Britain, that was the aircraft that won the war for those folks. And here they are in May of 44. Whoop. They are in 44 training with the British just before the invasion of D-Day, studying the maps, studying some of the targets. Well, anyway, while we work on this technical problem, the CVS-7, the British Spitfire squadron, flown by American pilots, like I said, specially selected, specially trained, and they went through an intensive, quick training regimen on this very speedy aircraft. And in just before D-Day, Bob Adams fell ill. He had a terrible sinus infection, and in fact, on June 5th, which was the original day of the invasion, he was bedridden. And sure enough, 24 hours later, after Eisenhower had postponed the invasion, Bob Adams is one of the British Spitfire spotter pilots, the eyes of the fleet, so to speak. So as the guys wake up on the morning, 4 a.m., the morning of June 6, 44, they walk out to their aircraft. The engines are running, and they've also been painted with the white stripes on the wings, on the tails and on the fuselage. And they also had American crews. So this was an American-run operation with just British aircraft. And that day, Bob Adams takes off with a wingman flying at 2,000 feet over the English Channel. And they've got 2 targets for that morning. In just in a minute here, we'll get the map up and we'll show you exactly where these guys were operating. Just behind Omaha Beach, a little town called Theriot. It was a communication center. And this particular group, this pair, their mission was to fly into Theriot and to provide reconnaissance and spotter for the battleships that were just offshore. So they came into the area, and they were given specific instructions not to engage any enemy. They did have 6, as I said before, 6 cannons. They were armed, but they were specifically there for reconnaissance, forward observers, if you will. But there had been some previous reconnaissance that showed a large, a tall church steeple in the town of Theriot, and there was some photo reconnaissance that showed a German artillery spotter in this church steeple. So these guys knew this going into it. They had studied the charts and the maps and the photographs coming in. And Bob Adams, on that morning, before he flew into his target, the communication center, he flew past the church steeple, saw the German in there, and realized that they got 170,000 troops, Allied troops coming ashore, and this enemy posed a serious threat. So he turned on his guns and took him out. He called in for the artillery from the USS Augusta and other ships and walked these salvos into the communication center, a large target area, and obliterated the target. He and his wingman then moved on further to the southwest along the Normandy coastline in between Utah Beach and Omaha Beach to a town called Insignia, which was also another a preeminent target. It also held a road junction that went from Utah Beach to Omaha Beach. And again, they flew in the area and called in the forward observation, and the big ships offshore neutralized the target. And on that morning, around 8 a.m., 9 a.m. on D-Day, on Omaha Beach in particular, things weren't going so well for the American Fifth Corps. They were having difficulties. The Germans were heavily entrenched, heavily fortified, heavily armed, and the Americans were getting killed, and they were taking heavy casualties. And the tide was coming in quickly, and they were running out of daylight. And at one point, General Bradley, actually considered taking the second and third wave forces expected on Omaha Beach and moving them either to the British beaches or to the Utah beach, where they were having much more success. But at around the same time, an amazing thing happened. Some of the captains aboard these ships, aboard the destroyers and the cruisers and the battleships, they saw what was going on. They saw that the American soldiers were having a very difficult time, and they could see the targets. They pulled up their anchors and moved in closer, some as close as 400 yards in towards the beach, putting their ships and crews at danger, but in fact, they turned the tide of the battle. And as one D-Day veteran, Al Spoonheimer, says, those ships came in so close, I thought they had wheels. And this is Bradley's statement later on. He says, the effect on the troops was electric, talking about the Navy ships that came in and took out some of these targets. What the Navy had done was to give the men on Omaha Beach a fighting chance. And one of his commanders on the ground later said, thank God for the U.S. Navy. And finally, the Americans on Omaha Beach reached the bluffs, took out the enemy pillboxes, and secured a toehold on Fortress Europe, never to give it up. But here's where the story gets interesting, and perfect timing by our technical director over there. You're doing a wonderful job. Right about the time that Bob Adams was flying his last mission over the town of Insigny, he took on some artillery, anti-aircraft artillery fire on his British Spitfire aircraft. And he realized that he was losing fuel and that he was going to have to put his bird down somewhere. And his choices were try to crash land it somewhere in a field. You run the risk of crashing into a hedgerow and getting killed or captured. What about ditching the aircraft in the English Channel? What are the chances of getting rescued there while there's a major battle going on? He knew he couldn't make it back to England. And so before the invasion, they had decided that in case there was an emergency, that there was an area that was going to be secured on Utah Beach where aircraft could land in an emergency. And so he knew that. He radioed to his wingman, told his wingman to head back to England, and he was going to go put his aircraft down on Utah Beach. There they are preparing with maps. There's Bob Adams and his aircraft painted. This must have been after they returned after D-Day. Coming across the channel on the dawn on D-Day, there's his first target, Theriot. At 7:30 in the morning, that target was neutralized. Insigny, another little town right there on the coast, it was taken out. Omaha Beach, as we just talked about, was having some serious problems, so the Navy came in and saved the day. And then this is where the fellow decides to take his aircraft down. So he's coming into the area and he sees where some engineers in some tractors and some bulldozers had cleared out this little small landing strip. So he comes in his British Spitfire. This is an American pilot from Houma, lives in Lafayette, South Louisiana. Comes in, is not sure if the men on the ground and the anti-aircraft are going to start shooting at him, but he's got his aircraft painted with the liberation stripes, and he tilts his wings to let them know that he's friendly and he's coming in, puts down the landing gear, and lands right on Utah Beach. At that moment, Bob Adams became the first Allied pilot to land in France on D-Day. And it was a busted fuel line. The mechanics on the ground checked him out, noticed it, put oil back into his engine, put him a new fuel line, fixed him up. He started back up his engine, turned around, and flew out about an hour later. Flew back to England. went back in. I'm sure he told a marvelous story, and none of his partners believed him at the time. But then he got back in his aircraft, and he went back out that afternoon for his second mission, which were behind Omaha Beach. So he actually flew 2 missions on that day. And for his actions on D-Day, Bob Adams was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He flew for 3 weeks following D-Day, flying spotter aircraft, forward reconnaissance in and around the Normandy area. He actually flew 13 missions before he was reassigned to the invasion of southern France, Operation Anvil Dragoon, where again he flew another 13 missions before his time was up. Here's a photograph of Bob Adams with his Coast Guard auxiliary shirt and a wall of his treasured memories, I'm sure. Bob Adams. How about this fella? Lloyd Berard. Miss Mary, is that the man you married right there? Well, I'll tell you what, Mr. Lloyd Berard is quite a character, and he and his wife have a marvelous story, so I'm so glad they're here today, and I'm so glad to tell you folks this great story. Okay, the Mulberry Harbor was a British invention, and this is a fantastic story. Lloyd Berard was actually working on a dredge boat on the Panama Canal before the war started, from Coda Homes near St. Martinville. And he came back to the States and was working at Morgan City on a dredge boat. And he realized that he was of draft age and that at some point in time the service was going to come and get him. So he was taking frequent trips back to Lafayette to check with the draft board, as a good young American male was doing at that time, making sure the draft board wouldn't ride him too hard. But he had asthma, so he was poured out for his service. Could have been given a deferment, but instead he decided to join. He joined, and the recruiting officer said, "Lord, you know, all you could be doing is limited duty. So thank you for joining the U.S. Army." So he joins the engineers. Obviously, he had some experience before the war, and they put him into that unit. And when he got to Beauregard, is it Beauregard for your basic training? He says, "I'm Lloyd Berard. I'm 4F. I'm here for my my limited duty." And he says, "Limited duty? How about unlimited duty?" Tore up his paper and said, "Get in line with the rest of them." Lloyd was sent to Fort Belfer in Virginia, and he was assigned to the 372nd Engineer Battalion. And these guys were experts at laying steel mats, particularly in the swampy, marshy areas, and they were training for this. And then later on, in the end of 43, early 44, Lloyd and his crew were sent overseas for the build-up in England for the eventual invasion of Normandy. They landed, and they made their way to Purfleet, England. It was a 150-mile trek on foot with 60 pounds of gear, going through each and every little town, and I'm sure entertaining the British citizens along the way. And one thing about the Mulberry harbors, you see in 42, the Dieppe raid. The Dieppe raid proved a number of things that helped the Allies on D-Day. One of the things that it proved was that it was essential to have a port or a harbor intact following the invasion of Europe, whenever that would come. And the Allies knew that the Germans knew that that was very, very important to success and eventual retaking of the continent. And the Germans were going to have all the ports in between booby-trapped and blown up and destroyed as the Allies came creeping near them. So the British came up with an idea. They said, okay, if Normandy is going to be the area where we're going to land, there's no natural harbors. There's no port facilities, just a beach. Little towns, little villages, little cottages along the shore. how are we going to get all of our necessary men and materiel from England across the channel into France to defeat the German Weimar? Well, the British, particularly Churchill, came up with an ingenious idea. This is an idea he'd been holding on since the First World War. His idea was to build their own harbor, their own port facility, fabricate it in England, tow it across the English Channel, assemble it on or around D-Day, and have it ready and functioning to bring ashore the arsenal of democracy. Lord Montauban is quoted as saying, "As we have no harbor at our disposal, we shall bring our own." Another historian, Ron Dres, from New Orleans, this is what he had to say about this great invasion and this great engineering moment. Take every man, woman, and child in a city, in a large city. All of their pans, all of their toys and lawnmowers, all of their automobiles and all their beddings, and all of their fences, and load them up and move them 100 miles across a body of water overnight. And nobody can know that you are gone, and nobody can know that you are coming. He continues, the brilliance of this operation, referring to the Mulberry, even the unchallenged engineering technique to build one's own floating harbor and bring it over, is staggering. And that's what Lloyd Berard was assigned to do, was to help construct one of the components of this Mulberry. This is a giant piece of concrete. It was codenamed Phoenix. Mr. Lloyd refers it to as something else. What do you call it, Mr. Lloyd? What do you call those things? Mud barge. And essentially, that's what they were. For a Cajun, that's certainly what it would appear. But these things were massive. They were 200 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 80 foot tall. And they were made out of concrete. They were hollow on the inside, and the idea was to fabricate valves. And what Lloyd's job was to tend the valves as these components were loaded across the channel. And when they were set just right in place where they needed to be, these giant concrete caissons, valves would be opened and they would sink to the floor. And the idea behind Phoenix was to provide a breakwater system. And so hundreds of these were put together. In fact, 150 were constructed all told. It took over a year, 20,000 men, ungodly man hours. I believe it's 33 miles of concrete to help construct these Mulberry components. And his job, what Lloyd's job, what his engineer group was doing, was there were no fancy concrete mixing yards like we have today with your concrete trucks. They had to take rock and use heavy machinery to crush it, transport it to the area, crush it into smaller rock to be used to make the concrete to construct these behemoths. The depiction of one. Looks like Lloyd's group is getting ready to sail the mud barge on invasion. So you can see these things were colossal. They were gigantic. And here's a photograph of the tug ships actually towing these vessels across the English Channel on D-Day. And Lloyd was actually stationed, he and probably a few fellows were inside one of these concrete caissons for the invasion, floating it across to be set in place. Louisiana Public Education. Here's a recent photograph of one of these giant things. This is the one that's actually there's two of them, and they're off the coast near Arromanches. There were two Mulberry harbors, one for Omaha Beach for the Americans and one for the British at Arromanches. But look at the size of this thing. It's really incredible. Yeah, we could use those off our coast right here, huh? Mr. Lloyd, are you retired? Are you still in business? Huh? There you go. Lloyd's mud barges. But now, these Phoenix were only one component. Here they are being set up, and look at it compared to the size of a small landing craft on the bottom right corner. Now this is the Mulberry Harbor at Omaha Beach. You can see the red arrow is pointing to the concrete caissons, the Phoenix, the mud barges. And there were 150 constructed in all. In Lloyd's area, they were building 8 of them, he and his battalion and some other British folks. But there were also these vessels called gooseberries. These were old, obsolete cargo ships that were actually either floated or towed or actually maneuvered or sailed, I should say, on their own engines and purposely sunk off the coast of Omaha Beach. Now why this idea? Well, the English Channel was extremely rough and violent, particularly in June of 1944 with the terrible storms, the worst storms that they've had in 50 years. It actually postponed the invasion, as we've mentioned before. So the idea behind getting in the necessary ships and cargo material into this churning waters and to bring it ashore safely without any major problems, they were going to need to put up a barrier, a reef, if you will. And that's the purpose of these concrete caissons and these obsolete ships called gooseberries. So this is a perfect depiction of one. Let's see, guys move around. And on each one of the concrete caissons, you had a 20 millimeter anti-aircraft artillery piece. And as you can see, a little difficult to tell with this black and white photograph, but look at the difference in the water on the right side of the channel versus on the left. Looks a little bit calmer. We've got some smaller ships that are working in the area there, and further up north on the photograph, you can see the beginnings of the pier system. These things called Leibniz pier heads, sort of like a small jack-up pier. They had 60-foot pilings, six on these things, and these were constructed in England, floated across the English Channel, put in behind the concrete caissons, and these would be used to set in place and attach a pier, a half-a-mile pier to Omaha Beach and to Aramonch. These things were floated ashore, and as you can see, there were actually 3 piers that were constructed on Omaha Beach. And there were a dozen or so of these pier heads that were the initial offloading staging area. These things were secure, and they floated up and down. The tide in the channel at Omaha Beach went up and down about 10 foot on a given day, so these things had to float up with the tide. And as you can see, the 3 piers, these things were built of these steel landing sheets, 80 foot long, and each one of these piers was a half a mile extending to Omaha Beach. They could handle 25 tons. These two. The one in the back could handle 40 tons, the tanks and whatnot. So, as Ron Drez said, an engineering marvel to float one's own harbor. Took a couple of days to get this thing together, but they had it very well planned out. And on D-Day, when Lloyd came ashore and his commander explained to him exactly where they wanted to lay down this mud barge, he tended the valves, turned it on, flooded the inside of the concrete caisson, and it set right in place. And as one of the previous pictures shows, there's probably several of those things still located off the beaches of Normandy. These things were codenamed whales. As I said before, just a floating pontoon. These were steel trusses, and these things were attached to the piers, and they would float up and down as the tide would come up. There's pier construction, as you can see, piers coming ashore to Omaha Beach here, bringing trucks and jeeps and food and ammunition, offloading equipment from the pier, onto the pier head. Here's a great photograph of one of the pier heads, and as you can see, a hospital ship parked next to it. So they're actually bringing wounded troops from the beaches in the ambulances and bring them onto a hospital ship. So this thing, in theory, was a fantastic idea. And to build this with 20,000 men taking a year with some of the figures that we mentioned before is really phenomenal. Unfortunately, it only lasted 3 days. On June 19th, just 3 days after the Omaha Beach Mulberry A had become fully functional, it was destroyed by a terrible storm. Basically wiped out. And the storm threatened the British Mulberry, but there was a reef that divided the two beaches, and it was actually protected and didn't cause too much damage. They were actually able to reuse some of this material to repair some of the damage that occurred at the British Mulberry Harbor. And up until November, the British Mulberry Harbor stayed intact, stayed functioning, and for a long time, until we were able to take Cherbourg and Le Havre and some of the other big ports, that was really the only access to bringing ashore the men of material. So was it worth it? For 3 days, they did get to bring a lot of men and guns and necessary supplies into Omaha Beach, but it's a shame that it was destroyed a few days later. Does everyone here know who that is? Right. Rosie the Riveter. I know we have at least one here tonight. So Lloyd Berard goes back to England after he sets in place his mud barge. And he's building Nissen huts there with his engineering battalion. And from there, the guys go over across the English Channel to do similar activities. They're building schools, putting in plumbing and doing some construction work, building Nissen huts within the area. Now, the one thing that this occasion had over other American GIs was that he could speak French. And so he was the liaison man for the lumber yard. The Frenchman that ran the lumber yard became real good friends with Lloyd. Lloyd would go over there. Obviously, they didn't have 2x4, but what did they have, like a 3x3? So you had to kind of figure it out. So Lloyd became good friends with this old boy, and in fact, they spent a lot of time together. And there's a story that Lloyd told me about the old Frenchman. Hey, boy, I'd like to get my hands on cheese. You know, it's kind of hard to come by with the locals around here. But I tell you what, you could get it. You're an American soldier. So Lloyd said, all right, get in the Jeep and we'll take off. And they took a drive and they found a cheese factory or a little market that was selling the cheese. And this old fella bought a big old giant block of it, put it inside the Jeep and took off. And they were coming up to a checkpoint, and the old fella got real paranoid. He says, oh, I'm caught with this. Let's hide it underneath the seat. And Lloyd says, hide, man. They can smell that from a mile away. What you talking about? So they did become very good friends, as I mentioned. Lloyd had dinner and wine at this fellow's house with his wife. You recall the gentleman's name, Mr. Lloyd? The Frenchman's name. What was his name? Do you remember? No? Okay. Before yesterday. 62 years ago. So Lloyd, on his way to visit this fella one afternoon, he receives some mail. And he gets to the fella's house, and he's sitting on the porch at this fella's house, probably drinking a little red wine. And he opens up the letter, and it's some photographs of his nieces. And in astonishment and excitement, he says, in good old Cajun French, "Ness." And the Frenchman heard him. He came out and was dumbfounded and says, "Dis comme da dis?" Say it like you say it. Say that again. And Lloyd reverted back to the traditional French. See, all the while he had been in France, he was trying to mingle with the natives and speak the traditional French. But yet in his fit of excitement, he started talking like he did back home. And the Frenchman was astonished by this, and he called his wife. He says, "Come here, you got to listen to this American GI. He talks just like we do. This is the ancient French. Hadn't been changed in a couple hundred years. Is that right?" A year later, unfortunately, in February of '45, Lloyd was involved in a serious accident. He and a couple of guys were changing a tire on a big deuce and a half, and from down the road came streaming a bunch of Frenchmen were driving a captured German half-track, I believe it was. And whether or not they weren't paying attention to the directions or didn't know the speed limit or didn't know how to operate the vehicle, they came and crashed into this group of men who were changing a tire. And in fact, Lloyd recalls, as he saw this vehicle coming towards him, he took off running towards the front of the deuce and a half truck and thought that he could grab a hold of the side mirror and throw himself up over the hood. But he didn't quite make it. And he was severely injured, almost killed. Sent back to England to recuperate, sent back to the United States, where he sat in a hospital for a while in Memphis, Tennessee, I believe it was. And it was sometime later before a commander and officer informed him that the other 3 men were killed in that terrible accident. But something good did come from this terrible tragedy. Lloyd's sister was working at Consolidated Steel, and her roommate, Miss Mary, was actually working there with her as well. And young women back in the day often wrote letters to the GIs overseas, sympathy letters, if you will. And so Lloyd's sister talked Mary into writing a similar letter to Mr. Lloyd. And so she did so, expressing her concern and wishing him well. And when Lloyd received the letter, he said, "Oh, wow, I got a Cajun girl down there. Huh? She likes me. Let's see what's going on here." So at some time later, Lloyd was given a 30-day leave of absence. And he was going to go to New Orleans, where his family decided to throw a welcome home Lloyd party. Now here's where fate plays in. Mary's brother, was actually wounded in the Pacific on an aircraft carrier. And so she was getting from her employer essentially a get off of work free card for the day. And so she wanted to go to Lloyd's party. And so she arrives there, and the Berard family, as they always do, passing a good time and cutting up and doing a lot of dancing. And there's poor old Lloyd. He's broken down, he's crippled, he's in crutches and broken bones all over the place. He's looking across the room, and he's looking at her, and he's trying to get Mary's attention. And she just feels so pity for him because he looks he's so beat up. He had a rough time recuperating. And she actually said, writing letters to her during that period, she said, "It looks like chicken scratch. What's wrong with this guy?" She just felt so sorry for him. Poor guy could probably ride. His arms had been broken, and ribs and legs and everything else. Lloyd gets up from his chair and walks over to her and says, "We'll dance." He looked at him and says, "You must be crazy. You can barely walk." And he says, "I can't walk, but I can dance." So I can imagine the two, Lloyd there with his crutches, trying to do a little two-step jitterbug, if you will. But as Lloyd says, that's where he met the love of his life. And from that day, and for the next 30 days, they were together, and they went dancing every single day in New Orleans. When Lloyd gets back to the hospital in Memphis, the doctors are astonished at how fast he had recuperated. They said, "We've never seen a man so broken heal so quickly. It's a miracle." A month later, Lloyd and Mary were married, and I'm proud to say, happy anniversary today, Miss Mary and Mr. Lloyd. That's going to conclude our first part of the presentation this evening. We're going to stop a little bit early because we've got second half that may go a little bit longer. Houston Duhon from New Iberia, Carol Medier from Lowerville, Louisiana. Members of the 397th Anti-Aircraft Special Battalion, Heavy Weapons, pardon me. Can't hear me in the back? Okay. No problem. This unit right here made the invasion at 7:30 a.m. on Omaha Beach. Easy red sector to be precise. Planning for the invasion, the Allied commanders believed that the Luftwaffe would make an appearance on the beaches that morning, as Mr. Lloyd would be able to attest to. The Luftwaffe was at that time severely weakened. They didn't have the experienced pilots. Obviously, the fuel shortage was a problem and loss of aircraft. But however, the Allies believed that it was possible for the German Air Force to seriously hamper their success on D-Day, which is one of the reasons why they decided to bring in first anti-aircraft units. And the 397 was a 50 caliber machine gun unit, and they were sent ashore ahead of the first wave. Now, Carol Medier is a Cajun from Lowerville, Louisiana, and Mr. Medier was one of the first gentlemen whom I interviewed 5 or 6 years ago. Got a telephone call from his brother, Farbus Medier, who was the mayor of the little town, and he says, yeah, you guys can come over. Excuse me. He says, you guys can come over, but I don't have much to tell. He says, but my brother, Carol, boy, he's got quite a story. He made the D-Day invasion. Y'all are welcome to come over. So my grandfather and I show up. Now, mind you, we had just started interviewing veterans. In fact, this was the second trip that we had taken to interview one of the Cajun veterans. When we get there, it was Farbus Medier, his brother Carol, their friend Lloyd Broussard, and their next-door neighbor, Louis Prince, and all four of their wives. The good thing I brought enough tapes and batteries, because we spent about 6 hours at their home talking about World War II. It was fantastic. But sure enough, true to form, Carol Medier did tell a phenomenal story. He experienced the worst of D-Day, but as he would talk, it was almost as if it was comical to him to some respect, as if he couldn't believe that this poor Cajun boy from Lowerville had put himself in this position. And so he oftentimes would chuckle or laugh at the thought that he, some kind of way, survived when many others did not. He could not believe the experience that he had on that beach and stayed with him all these many years. Before the war broke out, he was a stock boy at a local grocery store, and the grocery owner offered to get him a deferment. Carol had never been outside of Lowerville before. He says, no, I want a chance to see the world, so he joined the Army in 1943. And as he told me, he says, you know, I didn't know my butt from the hole in the ground. Took his training at Camp Berard, was sent to Illinois to train at Fort Sheridan in the anti-aircraft unit. I asked him, I said, well, why did they put you in the anti-aircraft unit? He says, because I wasn't good for anything else. So one of the first things that he's telling me about his great World War II experience was that every Saturday night they had a dance at Fort Sheridan. And of course, Carol would attend. And there was a pretty little Midwestern girl that would always sit off in the corner trying to remain obscure. Maybe she was hiding from him. But after a couple of weeks, he worked up enough courage and he walked over to ask her to dance. And he said, well, she was the prettiest little thing. Such a shame, he said. A pretty girl like that with 2 left feet. She couldn't dance worth a damn. And that's how this fellow starts off the interview. So after training in anti-aircraft artillery, being assigned to the 397th, he was shipped to Camp Shanks in New York, sent overseas on the Queen Mary. 15-day voyage where half of the guys were seasick to death. Carroll never did get sick, but when they landed in England, they had to cart off 15 young GIs in stretchers because they were so violently seasick. That's how bad the weather was coming across the Atlantic for these folks. They went down and were stationed at a place called Pontypridd in South Wales. And he and a handful of guys, Houston Duhon was one of them, they lived with a British family during the months of preparations and training for the big amphibious invasion on June 6th. And he referred to the lady and her sister who lived there as the old maids. Those old maids would fix us breakfast every morning before they went out. But they were very respectful of the British and very thankful to be there helping these kind folks out. And on June 4th, around June 4th, June 3rd, June 4th, men began to travel from their marshalling yards onto the LCI landing crafts and troop transports. And while they were down there, they spent time mingling with soldiers from other units. And in fact, there were there were a handful of other anti-aircraft units that were there, the 197th, 467th, to name a few. And these guys were in there in the marshalling yard preparing for Eisenhower to give the okay, let's go. And he recalls on the night before D-Day, this officer came up to us. And this is what he told us. He goes, "You men, you boys are the cream of the cream, hand-picked to do this job. And we know that you're going to make your country proud." And the 200 men looked at each other and said, "Who is this guy? Where did he come from? What is he talking about?" The troops had not yet been told about the invasion. They all knew it. They all felt it. Everybody felt it. But they didn't know exactly when it was coming. And Carroll, till today, remembers this officer who he had never met before come in and give him high praise. He was in the Company C of the 397th. There were only 200 men that were involved in this machine gun unit. And as they came across the English Channel in the morning of June 6th, their target was Easy Red Sector on Omaha Beach. One thing that made Omaha Beach difficult to capture was the 30-foot bluffs that hovered over the coastline. And as this map here illustrates, there's really only 4 main exits to get from the beach over the bluffs. Exit 1 through 4. And exit 1 is in the area where the red arrow is pointing. That is the Easy Red Sector, where the 1st Infantry Division came ashore. In fact, for this day, the 397th was attached, and they would provide anti-aircraft cover for any potential German Luftwaffe that may make an appearance on that day. So as they come ashore in the little Higgins boats, Carroll says, they wanted us on that beach at 7:15 a.m. and they didn't miss it by much. We took off, and we got about a half a mile from the beach. All hell broke loose, he says. Explosions, guns blazing, machine guns, bullets hitting the water like rain. I asked myself, what the hell am I doing here in an experience like this? A country boy from Lowerville, and here I am. As the ramp of the Higgins boat came down into the bloody waters on Omaha, the 30 men in the machine gun squad began to exit the landing craft. Carroll, as the squad leader of his particular group, was in the back of the ship along with Houston Duhon, his buddy, and the 3 other men assigned to that particular machine gun. Carroll was in charge of carrying the barrel, the 16-pound barrel for the 50 caliber. He also humped a 60-pound pack on his back, carried a carbine and all the other necessary equipment May West vest and the gas mask. Houston was assigned to carry the ammo. He also had 60-pound pack on his back and a rifle. And as these two men came to the gate on the big Higgins boat and leaped into the jaws of hell, they had made the invasion together. They had gone into training together. They had gone overseas together, and they lived together in England. And for the greatest invasion of the 20th century, 3,000 miles away from the Bayou Teche, these two men jumped into the waters off of Omaha Beach. Only one of them made it to the beach alive. Carroll relates a story as he turned around to grab the barrel, and Houston turned around to grab the two ammo boxes. Houston was hit in the back of the head with enemy machine gun bullets, and he died almost instantly. So Carroll grabs his friend, brings him ashore, lays him down in the sand, hollers for a medic, and moves on to fend for his own life. And he says, "There were men floating and dead men in the water. Dying and floating men were getting killed all around me. They get blown up into pieces. I didn't know what happened in Houston. I never saw him after that." This was on Omaha Beach. Of the 200-man company, 36 machine guns, only 28 machine guns made it up the hill that day. They also took 80% casualties within the first 30 minutes. Houston Duhon was one of them. So they came ashore, and as I said, Carroll moved on to fend for his own life. Bombs were going off, men stepping on mines, getting blown up into bits. And he was able to set up a few guns in a little area and dig a foxhole, waiting for the Luftwaffe to show up. And he said there was a guy broke out a can and opened a can and was eating some beans. And he hollered at him and he says, "Hey man, get down, there's bombs coming in." Germans are dropping mortar and artillery fire. And the guy didn't listen to him. And sure enough, a mortar landed and blew the whole side of the guy's face off, killed him. So all of this terrible horror is going on around Carroll. He has already lost his buddy, didn't know where he was. Certainly didn't make it to the beach on his own. And so Carroll moves on about his business. And this is the area that we think is where Carroll and Houston came ashore. This is a recent photograph just south of a German enemy gun emplacement where Houston was probably killed. And these are some of the first graves that they dug in the area a couple of days after D-Day to temporarily bury the dead. And then a few years later, the American Battlefield Monuments Commission acquired property in Normandy and in other places, as they do all around the world. And this is a photograph of the beginnings of the Omaha Beach Cemetery. As you can see, they're lining up the crosses, exhumed the bodies, and then buried them here later on. This is what it looks like today. It is a marvelous, beautifully well-designed, unbelievable piece of territory. When you walk through this cemetery, it's difficult to breathe. Those of you who have been there know what I'm talking about. It is an awesome sight to see these 9,300 and some odd crosses and stars of David, of those men who made that invasion and gave the ultimate sacrifice. This is the cemetery that's nestled right off of Omaha Beach in a little town called Curleville. And it has access right down to the beach area. One of the fellows buried there is Houston D. Duhon, probably first class from New Iberia. Killed that morning. In 2003, I took a trip to the D-Day Museum to see a friend of mine give a presentation Shane Berard. He's written a book, Cajun Americanization of the People. And one of the first chapters that he writes is about their involvement, the Cajuns' involvement in World War II. And so I'm sitting there with my wife, and we're listening to Shane talk about this Cajun named Houston Duhon. And the only bit of information that he had was a photograph from the American Battlefield Monuments Commission. He had contacted the surviving family. There was a sister and a handful of nieces and nephews, but no one in the family really knew the circumstances behind his death. And there I am, and I want to raise my hand and say, Shane, I know exactly what happened. I interviewed the fellow who was not 2 feet away from him when he took the bullet. So at that time, he and I, we decided that we needed to do something to commemorate this man's life. Shane had the idea of drafting a resolution to honor him on the 60th anniversary of D-Day, which would have been the following year. And we also had the idea of placing a wreath at the gravesite of this man who's buried in France. And we started talking. I said, well, how about if I go to Normandy and bring the wreath myself? We'll draft up the resolution and see if any of the politicians will sign it for us. So we did that and began preparations. I contacted the Stephen Ambrose Tours in New Orleans, and one of the sons there said, boy, there's limited space right now. It's a year out from the big 60th anniversary. He says, let me give you a telephone number of a guy named Spoonie. Al Spoonheimer. He lives in Vermont. He's the head of this association, this anti-aircraft group, and they've got a bus that's going down there. He may be able to get you one. So a few days later, I call this fella, very nice fella, and I start talking to him, and I can remember the conversation we have right now. And I explained to him what I just explained to you all. And the fellow starts crying on the phone, and he says, I'm going to have to call you back. I said, oh, I hope I didn't open any sore wounds. He calls me back a few minutes later, and he says, I have to apologize, Jason. I was a medic on Omaha Beach that day. I was in a anti-aircraft artillery, and we came ashore on half tracks on armored vehicles. He says, but there was a unit that came alongside of us who disembarked from Higgins. He says, and every one of the men that I treated that day had a 397 on their arm. And there was 80% casualties in the first 30 minutes. He says, we definitely want you to come, and we'll make room on the bus with you, and we want to go and present this wreath at his gravesite. So I said, great. So that got the ball rolling. And before we get to this, the little that we do know about Houston Duhon, he was born in 1923 in New Iberia, one of 15, grew up on the Dewey Plantation along Bayou Teche. His father was a sharecropper down there. And he worked as a Western Union telegraph delivery guy on a bicycle for 5 years. When he was 17, he joined the Army. He was also given an award for bravery during training, basic training. He rescued a recruit who was drowning and was given some type of award. We're not exactly sure, but we know that he was recognized for saving that young man's life. And Carol and he became very good friends. They didn't know each other back home, but they got to meet when they got to Illinois and made the invasion together. So I went on the tour, D-Day, to the Rhine, with the 197th Anti-Aircraft Battalion. And Spoonheimer, everyone calls him Spoonie, that's how he's affectionately known, was certainly provided a lot of entertainment for the 12 days we were down there. This is a very interesting character, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit about him here. We started off in England. The Imperial War Museum is a must if you ever go down there. Fabulous. They have a wonderful World War I display, Trench warfare. And it really gives you a sense of what took place in that battle in the early part of the century. Southwick House. This is the house that looks over Portsmouth, which was where Eisenhower and his men met to decide what they were going to do on D-Day. And in fact, here is the Shape War Room, and behind the veterans is the map, the big war room map, where Eisenhower and his bunch studied over and made plans and preparations for the Allied invasion. This is the room where he said, what are we going to do about the weather situation? And the climatologist, Stagg was his name, came in and said, it's going to be clear on the 6th of June. There'll be a small window. And Eisenhower says, let's go. There's Spoonheimer right in the middle. And then his buddies from the 197th on the left-hand side, and the other two gentlemen, one was in the 29th Infantry Division, and one was in the Engineering Battalion. These are the 5 D-Day veterans that came on this trip. So for 12 days, we got to hear some amazing stories from these guys. This is Portsmouth, where the debarkation took place on D-Day. This channel would have been lined with Higgins boats and landing craft and troop transports of all kinds. Crossed over on a nice little ferry, a cruise ship. Had a wonderful 6-hour drive across the channel. Got to meet a lot of British veterans. And you can easily make a distinction between the British veterans and the American veterans. The American veterans, they may have a little ball cap with 1 or 2 little pins and maybe first ID, and they've got their families with them. British are a little bit different. All of these guys come decked out in suits and ties and berets, and half of these guys are falling over because of so many medals that they're wearing, and they're in the 4 or 5, and you can always point out where the noise is coming from, over by the bar. Most of these guys were no strangers to putting down pints of beer. But they do this every year, and we got to meet quite a few of them. And I will say that I got to know 3 or 4 of them on that afternoon, and the only thing that these guys, that they kept harping on was the importance of what the Americans did on the beach that day, of how heroic the Americans were. Most of these guys, you know, we just got off and came onto the beach and got on our bikes and drove ahead off of Sword and Juno Beach. It was the Americans that had the really tough time. They're the ones who won the Battle of Normandy. In the background is Aire-Manche. This is the Normandy coastline. And there's Normandy, France. This is a view from one of the German pillboxes just over Verville Draw. As you can see, the tide is almost completely out. In fact, this is a photograph from later on in the morning. So Captain Ron Dres leads our tour, at least for the first 6 days. He's got his son, Ron Dres Jr., to pick up from when he takes off. And these guys put on quite a tour. This is a photograph of Omaha Beach. This really gives you an idea of what these men were up against. This landscape would have been paved in underground landmines. The bluffs on the right, at one point there was a shingle, a 6-foot shingle, that has since been removed. But that would have been covered in machine gun nests and mortar squads, pouring and enfilading fire onto the beach as these inexperienced men were ashore. And look at this. This is a group of people who started walking out to the water's edge. That's about 400 yards. This is early in the morning on D-Day, and the tour guides wanted us to get there early in the morning to see what it was like 60 years ago, to see how far these men had to run to get to safety. And it wasn't just the 400 yards through the wet sand covered in landmines and obstacles. They were dropped off half a mile offshore into the water. The Higgins boats, the coxswains, pulled open the gates and said, "Get out." Some of these guys jumped in 4 or 5 foot of water. They were covered in gear and equipment, like Carroll and Houston Duhon, over 100 pounds, soaking wet in these wool uniforms, seasick, and tossing and turning off in Portsmouth and some of the other debarkation channels for 3 or 4 days. Probably hadn't had much to eat except fish and chips, powdered eggs, or whatever the British were feeding them. But this is what is so amazing about Normandy and how anyone ever survived that battle. to be able to come ashore in the water and make it up to the sand. There's myself and Albert Spoonheimer, photographed on Omaha Beach. Point to Hawk, where the Rangers went up the cliffs and captured the guns up there. One of the most dangerous missions on D-Day. In fact, within 5 minutes of these men coming ashore, the first Ranger had gotten up on top and the Rangers had completed their mission. The guns, as we all know, set up behind the actual Point to Hawk gun emplacements. They were being camouflaged with these large telephone poles that had been painted black, and aerial reconnaissance did not pick that up. And a handful of these Rangers went out and found where the guns were, and they disabled them and took them out, completing their mission on D-Day. It looks like the moon. It looks like the craters on the moon when you walk around the Point to Hawk area, if any of you have ever been there. So much aerial bombardment had taken place right here in the weeks and months and even the days leading into D-Day, which really does not look of this earth. Here's one of the concrete pillboxes, the encasements where the guns of Point to Hawk were located before D-Day. This here is a gun emplacement on Easy Red Sector on Omaha Beach. This gun was categorized as WN64, one of the many larger size pillboxes, concrete encasement pillboxes. They had a 50mm cannon inside. They also had machine gunners. Roughly 40 men manned this particular gun emplacement. And it was right at the roadblock of exit E1, right where Carroll and Houston and Spoonheimer and their crew needed to capture. One of the only exits off of Omaha Beach. This is the gun that was guarding it. And you'll notice the plaque on the wall. The plaque says 467th Anti-Aircraft, one of the other half-track units that came ashore. So, and we'll get to a map here in just a second, but you've got 3 anti-aircraft units that are coming ashore in roughly the same area. 2 are in armored half-tracks. Some have the 50 caliber quads. Some have the 30mm artillery pieces. And in between these 2 half-track units are the GIs, the machine gunners with the 50 calibers, Carroll and Houston. So the Allies said, yeah, we really need a lot of artillery down there on the beach. They were really concerned about the Luftwaffe, and their initial plans proved that. But the plaque up there is the 467. Now, the way the story goes, as history books have now written, is there's a fellow by the name of Haas who was actually on one of the half-tracks on the Higgins boats, on the LCVP, when they were coming ashore, and this gun began firing towards the landing craft, and he began firing his gun from his half-track, and he is credited with taking out this gun. And half a dozen or so Germans were captured later on, and that plaque is dedicated to his unit, giving his unit credit for taking out this gun. Spoonheimer, for the 12 days we were down there, swore up and down that he never saw anyone from the 467. And this guy, at 82 years old, had a cracked memory, even though he's probably been drinking every day for the last 60. But he swore up and down. I mean, he would even talk to reporters about this. And Andres would try to calm him down. Don't make a scene. They never ran into anyone from the 467. It might have been an incident. But Thomas swore up and down that it was his unit that took out this gun. So some animosity that's still brewing after 60 years. So I get back from Omaha Beach, and Spoonie says, "You heard this story. I'm telling you, my unit's the one that took it out." And I call this fella by the name of Charlie Hagan. He's a barber in New Iberia. And I called him up and I said, "Charlie, I'd like to come and interview you." I said, "What was your unit?" He said, "I was in the 467. I said, "You got to be kidding me. I'm coming over right now." I said, "The plaque, WN64? And he says, "Yep. I was the one that was responsible for securing this plaque and for getting the funds and for getting all of the paperwork that goes involved." And this plaque was actually dedicated on the 50th anniversary. And Haas was there and all the other members. And so I told Spoonheimer that, and he wasn't. say the least. And this is the map showing where WN64 is located, and as the anti-aircraft groups are coming ashore, and that's what they were up against. And this is on June the 5th, and we get a call that one of the news organizations wants to interview him. And he did keep the peace. He didn't mention anything about the what he thought of who really deserves that plaque. But there he is talking about the men from the 397th, Carroll and Hastings group. And he's talking about how in the marshalling yards before the invasion, that these groups became friends. And they played cards together. And they threw horseshoes together. And they became friends. And right here he's saying when he came to the beach and he saw the men from the 397th, that it was very difficult. Many of them did not make it. In this bunker, this German bunker sector, eventually became a command post for one of the engineering groups down there, and it's been in several photographs from the weeks following D-Day. So on the night of June 5th, we all go out to dinner, and Spoonheimer and myself are staying up talking about D-Day and what it meant to me and what it meant to him. And there's a French bartender who's over listening to our conversation, and they were shutting down at midnight. We were in Cannes, and this guy Spoonheimer drinks like a fish, and kept me up for 11 straight nights. And on the night before D-Day, the 60th anniversary, this guy had us staying up till 12, 1 o'clock at night, and the boss man, Captain Drez, ordered us to be up and on the bus at 5 a.m. No questions asked. If you're not on the bus at 5, you're going to be left behind. So we get on the bus, we make it. I don't know how this guy made it, but I figured out a way to make it. We get on the bus, we head an hour-and-a-half drive, make sure that we're there in time to participate in the ceremonies. President Bush is coming, Chirac, some of the other dignitaries. And we get in, sure enough, we were one of the first in line. Walk right on through the security gates. Walking along the view of Omaha Beach, this is a huge compound, a huge cemetery. We're walking through it. It's actually around 170 acres. And you see Omaha Beach to your right, and as we're walking up, the folks in front of us stop and look off to the left. And everyone in front of us seems to do the same thing, stop for just an instant, and then move on. And as we got up to this view, you can see why. All of a sudden, all of these beautifully white marble crosses and Star of David come shining out in the June morning sun. And this is the view that we see as we walk through the cemetery. A perfect row. And it's really an unbelievable feeling. Those of you who have been there, it's really hard to describe. Freedom is not free. There's 9,000 plus young American GIs who are buried there. Just to show you the horrific battle that took place on June 6, 1944. There was a 21-gun salute after a flight of A-10 Warthogs flew over. Both distinguished presidents gave their speeches. And we moved on. As you can see the ships offshore, 6,000 people were at this particular ceremony. It was amazing. Here's a group of soldiers leaving the cemetery, and there wasn't a word spoken. I mean, you could have heard a pin drop when this thing was over. It was really an awesome feeling. And there's don't have a photograph, but there's a balcony if you will. It stretches out into Omaha Beach. It's got a map. And there was this young fella, I guess he had his father and his grandfather by a wheelchair. And they were walking out, his grandfather pointed towards the beach, and his son turned him in, and he says, let me get one more good look at it. I don't think I'll be making this trip again. And lo and behold, found an old Kuzona mine. When everyone leaves the facility, all tourists had to exit and go into the parking lot. We had to wait for the dignitaries to shake hands and kiss cheeks and fly away. And at that time, I find out that our group is going to be leaving and going to St. Mary Glebe, where this large airborne drop was going to be taking place, similar to the 101st and the 82nd. And I asked Andre Jr., I said, are we coming back here? He says, no, after this we're moving on, Pegasus Bridge, Paris, and so forth. Well, I said, I'm going to stay. I can't make it. And he said to me like, I said, I've got something that I have to do. You see, it was so high security because of the dignitaries, because of post 9/11, that regular tourists were not allowed to walk in and amongst across to visit any of the grave sites. And the group gave us lunches, box lunches, because no one had any idea on how long we were going to have to be there, how long we were going to be in the parking lot, when they were going to let us leave. And none of this information was passed down to us. It was really up to the dignitaries and how they moved. Over thousands of paramilitary, French, security, the whole 9 yards, you name it. And I'll tell y'all a little side story. 6:30 a.m. after spending a night with spooning and baking in the hot French sun, I started feeling the need for a cup of coffee, because I hadn't had my coffee yet. So I walk around, and there's hardly anyone here yet. We're one of the first groups. And I find a group of American soldiers, about 4 of them. And I says, hey guys, you know where I can find a cup of coffee? And he says, yeah, follow us. We're going to walk on down this way. So we're walking, amongst the people, and come to another little area, and they says, here, we're going to cross through the woods right here. There's a little back road to get to a little coffee area. I says, okay. So I'm following these guys. Walking through, we come out, we're in the media section. There's all these giant tents and all these giant television vans that have the satellite dishes. So I walk in. Man, I tell you what, it was a beautiful sight. Donuts and orange juice and coffee for miles and miles, and no one was in there. And I had spent the night before with old Spoonheimer, so I was feeling it a little bit. So I helped myself out to have the donut and a cup of coffee and started walking on the way back. And the guys, they ran into their commander, their commanding officer. Boy, they popped too. Boy, he chewed them out for being out there. And so he told them to get back to their post, and they kind of waved goodbye. So here I am, I'm in the middle of the media section. There's no media. I got what I came for. I've got my coffee and my donut. Feeling good now. I'm charged. I can take the heat now. So I start trying to figure my way back out. Was it here through the woods right here? I think so. I was peeking through the woods, and I come up on a checkpoint from behind. And these guys turned around and thought that, well, you know what they thought. And I mean, they grabbed me, they started interrogating me, started stripping me down, looking at the little bag that I had, going through all of my stuff, asking me all these questions. Where's your badge? Where's your badge? Who are you with? I said, just a tourist. I'm just looking for a cup of coffee. And I tell you what, they made me pay for it. They made me go back outside and wait in line to get back in. Another hour and a half waiting in line, but yeah, it served me right. I shouldn't have been poking around back there. But for one of the highest level security events in 2004, I was able to sneak through. So that afternoon, I decided to stay. I find out that this reef is going to be delivered to this particular site. And so I've got a little bit of time to kill, and I find this grave of Theriot, a fellow from Louisiana, killed in late June, 2004, 29th Infantry Division. later on, a few months later, I'm actually in St. Martinville giving a presentation, and I showed this photograph, and the guy raised up his hand, and he says, "That was my stepbrother." I says, "You got to be kidding me." He actually married, the stepbrother married the widow of this Dovik fella. Follow the family tree, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th generation cousins. But what are the chances of that, finding a Theriot in and amongst these great heroes? So, as I'm walking to find Houston Duhon, and the Stephen Ambrose tour bus takes off, I knew that Captain Drez and Spoonie were staying behind to do some TV interviews. But I wasn't exactly sure where, and Spoonheimer says, "Man, look, if you find us, great. I don't know where this guy's taking me. We're going all over here and all over there." And I says, "Well, if I do find you, that'd be great." He says, "But I'm going to find my guy." So I find him, Houston Duhon. And lo and behold, in the tent in the background is a Fox News tent. And sitting in a darn chair is Spoonheimer and Drez doing the on TV interview. This is unbelievable. So I sit there and I find my guy who I've come so long and so far away to see, Houston D. Duhon, man I never knew. So I go up to the media tent, and Drez and Spoonheimer are done with their interview. I said, "He's right there." I mean, this was the second from the left. There's a little road where this little cart would drive, golf carts, and drop off these bouquets and these wreaths and whatnot. And so I said, "He's right there. Can you believe that? Among 9,000 some odd graves, there he is." So we decided to go and deliver this wreath. It had just shown. We dropped it right there. Had his name on it, or had my name on it, I should say, with his plot and row number. So us three, we start walking, and these 3 American GIs dressed in camouflage walk past, and they're kind of intrigued at what we're doing. And I said, "Why don't you guys follow us? We're going to be honoring this American soldier." And it was kind of interesting because as I grabbed this wreath, started walking in, all of the other people who were just bystanders, just walking around looking at things, were drawn into this one particular site. And it was really very respectful that they didn't know who we were or what was going on, but yet they realized that something was happening. And so I lay a wreath with Spoonheimer, the medic, who may have been the last person to see Houston Duhon. Captain Drez says a prayer. We take photographs. And halfway around the world, in the little town of New Iberia in the city square, they are honoring Houston Duhon with a resolution. Members of the Louisiana legislature had drafted and signed a resolution and were presenting it to Houston's only surviving sibling, his sister, Doris Duhon Eldler. So from 3,000 miles away, I think we completed our mission in honoring this fallen hero, the only Cajun who we know of that was killed on Omaha